Hey, church family. I wanted to take this opportunity to present you with another word of encouragement as we prayerfully move forward into the future. Now, it's the third Monday in January, and what this means is that this is the money that we set aside to take the time to remember and memorialize the famous martyr of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. We know him as MLK for short, and so MLK, he was actually born on January the 15th, 1929. He was born in the deep South city of Atlanta, Georgia. And while it's true that he was the son of a Baptist minister, MLK also went on to earn a doctorate degree in systematic theology from Boston University. And during that time, he actually became the pastor of the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, which is located in Montgomery, Alabama. MLK delivered his acceptance speech on May the 2nd, 1954. It was at that point in time when King told his congregation this. He says, "I have no pretense to being a great preacher or even a profound scholar. I certainly have no pretense to infallibility. That is reserved for the height of the divine rather than the depths of the human." I love that. That's such a humble quote. He then goes on to declare this. He says, "I come to you with only the claim of being a servant of Christ and a feeling of dependence on His grace for my leadership. I come with a feeling that I have been called to preach and to lead God's people." Now, as he led his congregation there in Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. also decided to organize a social and a political action committee. According to him, all of this was for the purpose of keeping the congregation intelligently informed concerning the social, political, and economic situation. Then on December the 2nd, 1955, MLK conducted a meeting in the basement of the Dexter Avenue Church, and this resulted in the decision to launch the Montgomery bus boycott. And 3 days after the boycott, the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA, was founded. At that point in time, MLK's political endeavors began to keep him from accomplishing all of his pastoral responsibilities. And so by the end of 1959, King resigned from his pastorate there at the Dexter Church, and he joined his father's he joined with his father. At that point in time, he became co-pastor at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church. In this way, he could continue being a pastor, but then he could also dedicate more time to the civil rights opportunities that were opening up to him. And one example of this, well, he went and met with President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he also met with Vice President Richard M. Nixon. And after the Eisenhower administration, King eventually met with President John F. Kennedy, and he actually urged President Kennedy to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation in order to eliminate racial segregation here in America. By 1964, MLK had been named Man of the Year by Time magazine, and they were right to do so. By the end of that year, he received the Nobel Peace Prize at a ceremony in Oslo, Norway, and it was well deserved. The reason for that Peace Prize was due to the fact that Martin Luther King Jr., he was a man who constantly spoke out against violence. And instead, he constantly called for the end of racial segregation through peaceful means. It was during an interview with Mike Wallace when Reverend King declared this. He says, "I will never change in my idea that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom and justice." That's right, Martin Luther King Jr. was completely opposed to the use of violent means in order to accomplish a just and righteous end. I like the way that he described this nonviolent discipline. It was actually back in 1964 when Martin Luther King Jr. declared this. He says, "One of the great debates of history has been over the whole question of ends and means. All the way back from the days of Plato's dialogues, coming on up through Machiavelli and others, there have been those individuals who argued that the end justifies the means. But in a real sense, the non-violent philosophy comes along and says that the end is pre-existent in the means. The means represent the ideal in the making and the end in the process. And so that in the long run of history, immoral means cannot bring about moral ends. Somehow, man must come to the point that he sees the necessity of having ends and means cohering, so to speak. And this is one of the things that is basic in the nonviolent philosophy at its best. It gives one a way and a method of struggle which says that you can seek to secure moral ends through moral means. Without debate, MLK was a man who believed that the means have to be just as moral as the end we seek. MLK went on to describe the importance of nonviolent revolution by declaring this. He says, "It is possible to struggle against an evil, unjust system with all your might and with all your heart, and even hate that unjust system, but yet you maintain an attitude of active goodwill and understanding and even love for the perpetrators of that evil system." And this is the most misunderstood aspect of nonviolence. Simply put, Martin Luther King Jr. was saying that you can hate the sin, just don't hate the sinner. And as we consider the point that Reverend King was making, it breaks my heart to realize that this man who was completely committed to a loving, a peaceful, and a moral means to a righteous end, well, he ended up being shot and killed while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. And I just have to say that this is an incredible tragedy. It still is. It's heartbreaking to see a man who was committed to peace. He was completely committed to a peaceful approach at trying to secure racial justice here in America being gunned down in this way. And to add insult to injury, there are many Americans today who believe that they stand with MLK, all the while failing to grasp the point that King was actually making when he declared, "I look to a day when people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Martin Luther King Jr., he was fighting for the day when we would consider the content of a person's character without giving much regard for the color of their skin. The fact of the matter is this, I'm in my 50s, and throughout my years, I've known white people who are gracious and kind, and I've known white people who are cruel and unloving. At the same time, I've known black people who are gracious and kind, and I've known black people who are cruel and unloving. The fact is that the color of a person's skin doesn't determine whether they are of noble character or not. And it's sad to say that there are many in the world today who still believe that we can simply look at the color of a person's skin and determine whether they are of noble character or not. And what's even worse is that these racial divisions only seem to be getting worse and worse, which is why I encourage you to remember that we're all sinners. Every single one of us, we're all sinners who desperately need the transforming love of the Lord Jesus Christ. In order to prove my point, I would just remind you of something that Paul wrote in Acts chapter 17. It's there where he reminds us that God has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all of the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Christian, listen. God has made from one blood all the nations of the world. We can all trace our bloodlines back to Adam and Eve. And while the color of our skin might be different, the blood in our veins is the same. And not only that, but we've all been created in the image of God. We are the image bearers of God, regardless of the color of our skin. Therefore, as we take this day to remember Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., let's also remember that his desire was to see an America where our character of heart was more important than the color of our skin. With that as our goal, I encourage you, Christian, let's continue preaching the gospel message of Jesus Christ so that people from every tribe, tongue, and nation might be saved. And with that, let's continue fighting the good fight of faith, and all for the glory of God.